DREDD is a 2012 action movie based on the pretty well-known comic hero named Judge Dredd. Now, there was already, of course, a movie called Judge Dredd before this, starring Sylvester Stallone, but that movie was very much a product of its time, had a certain layer of cheese to it, and although it was fun and enjoyable, it's definitely a property that has enough potential to be remade, potentially in a grittier fashion. And that's exactly what DREDD does. In 2012, this movie showed that you could have something which is inherently cheesy, presented in a way that takes itself very seriously, but actually manages to pull that off really well. Now, financially, DREDD did not do very well at all. It's actually kind of well known for not doing very well. The budget is estimated to be around $30 or $40 million, and it only made $41 million at the box office. So the chances of us getting a DREDD 2 seem relatively slim, though its creators have said that could well happen based on the fact that it is so popular with fans. It has a cult status already, which for a 2012 film is pretty impressive. It usually does take a lot longer than that for a film to achieve that kind of status. Now, the film has a relatively small primary cast with a lot of background characters and supporting characters. Now, the three primary characters I would say in this film are Judge Dredd, a judge in training, and the boss villain, if you will. Dredd is played, of course, by Karl Urban, the judge in training, with some interesting superhuman abilities which prove quite useful in the film, is played by Olivia Thirlby, and the main villain of the film, called Mama, is played by the very well-known Lena Headey. So there's some pretty high-caliber actors in this film. And I would say one of the best aspects of this movie is that it manages to run the very fine line between taking itself seriously enough, but not taking itself too seriously. This is definitely a gritty, hard-edged action film. There is gore, there is a lot of violence, and it's very well done. It's not necessarily the goriest of violence all the time, but there is gore there, and it is most definitely a strong core action film. That is the primary purpose of the movie, non-stop action. And with the exception of a few minutes here and there, the vast majority of the film by far takes place within one massive apartment block, similar to movies like The Raid, which was also, of course, very popular among fans. Now, the film is relatively simple in terms of story, but what it manages to do with what it's given to work with, I think is really impressive. And the fact that it is, at its core, a simple action film means that the rewatchability in particular is far higher than, say, a mystery movie or a much slower horror film, for instance. Not that those things are bad, but this film is just the kind of movie that, due to its runtime at just over an hour and a half, the fact that it's constant fast-paced action with very little thought required, you can just follow along with the film and enjoy it, not that that's a bad thing either, means that you can just put it on any time and have fun with it. That being said, this is not a brainless film, far from it. As far as action films go, it's done really well, and speaking of being a thoughtful action film, there was one thing in particular that happens very early on in the movie that immediately made me know that I was going to enjoy it. And it wasn't actually related to action. It was that Judge Dredd, early on in the movie, has a decision to make when he's pursuing some criminals. And that is whether or not to use deadly force. In the Sylvester Stallone Judge Dredd movie, it may be just me, but I got the distinct impression in that film that he was kind of wanton with his violence. He would go straight to it as the first option. That was a product of its time, of course. This film, I expected to go even further down that route, essentially having Judge Dredd as a psychopath. It doesn't do that. In fact, it's the exact opposite. And that's another reason why I consider the character of Judge Dredd as portrayed in this film as being very similar to Batman. Now, of course, Judge Dredd is willing to kill, whereas Batman, for the most part, is not, unless, of course, he's being played by Ben Affleck. But that aspect to Dredd, shown, as I said, very early on in this film, made me know that they'd put thought into this. The fact that he doesn't use that force unless he has no other option really impressed me. It showed that he isn't just a guy with a big gun. In fact, it's quite the contrary. He puts thought into his actions, and as much as he wants to protect the city, he knows that adding violence to it constantly doesn't necessarily improve things. Just like Batman. I personally really enjoyed that aspect of his character, and although of course the film does get more and more violent as it gets more intense, that aspect to him is always there to some degree. But that's about as far as I can go into the film without spoiling anything major. So that's it for the overview. What about the individual scores? Well, first of all, of course, we have the story and the plot of this movie. And for the story and plot, I'm going to give the film a 7. Because although it is very, very simple, as I said, predominantly just set in one building, going after really one person with lots of minions working for her, it does a really great job of working with that simple premise to make it a non-stop, really engaging action film. So I'm giving it a 7. It's not going to win an Oscar anytime soon, but it's fun, it makes sense, and it's riveting. As far as the characters and their motivations, I'm going to give the film an 8, and that may seem a little high for an action film like this. Generally speaking, films like this don't really care about characters as much, it's more about the pure action. It doesn't really matter who's doing the action, as long as there is action. That's not the case with this movie. They have great characters in this film. Now, you don't necessarily get a full backstory or sob stories for any of the people in it, but they make sense, good and bad, and the characters are all interesting. Even those who would usually be just disposable idiots are actually more interesting than that. They put thought into every single person in the film, and I really like that. Next up we have, of course, the visuals and effects, and for the visuals and effects of this movie, I'm definitely going to give it a strong 10, because it's brilliant. As I said earlier, there's tons of action, there is some gore, there's plenty of blood, lots of explosions, bullets flying all over the place, and it's all done perfectly. As far as I'm concerned, at least, there was of course a mixture of practical and CGI to some degree, but the mix is done very well. You don't notice the blurred line between the two, and if you can get to that point where you don't even care what's CGI anymore, you've done a good job. So overall, a definite 10. As far as the audio and soundtrack, I'm going to give Dredd a 6, because it wasn't bad, that's above my baseline of 5, but at the same time it wasn't memorable. I don't recall any of the music in particular from the film, even immediately after watching it, and the music, as I often say with films, in this case, just did its job. It was tense in tense moments, elated in the very few elated moments, and everything in between. It did its job, nothing more, nothing less. Not for me personally, at least. So overall, I'm giving it a 6. And finally, for the most subjective, to me personally, the rewatchability and entertainment factor. And overall, for that rewatchability and entertainment, I'm going to give Dredd a 10. Because, as I mentioned earlier on in this video, the culmination of a lot of different small points put together really do make it, as far as I'm concerned, almost endlessly rewatchable. There is just enough intensity to the film without turning into just a full-on Gorno movie, and it's very rewatchable due to the fact that it's only, as I said earlier, just over an hour and a half long. It's definitely the kind of movie that you can put on with friends, because there's not a huge amount of dialogue, and if you miss stuff that's said, although of course it does matter, it doesn't matter as much as, say, in some other movies where they're totally dialogue driven. Overall, it's fun, it's well made, far better, in fact, in terms of the way it's made than it really could have been. It could have been made more shoddily and still been a great action film, but the attention to detail and the quality of the film really do take it to the next level. So overall, I'm giving it a 10 for the rewatchability and definitely for the entertainment factor, and that means that overall, as a tabulation of all 5 categories put together, I'm giving Dredd a pretty high rating of 4.1 out of 5, which is far higher than its box office would suggest. But that is one thing about this movie: even though it didn't do that well financially, it's done pretty well critically. Most people enjoyed this film and have good things to say about it. So suffice it to say, if you haven't checked out Dredd, which apparently a lot of people haven't, then definitely do so if you're an action fan, if you're also to some degree a superhero fan, because he is kind of a superhero in a Batman or RoboCop kind of way. Overall, I really enjoyed the film. It's very rewatchable. Check it out. But that's it overall for this particular review. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.